position, what can you expect from this speech? First, clarification of framework, the model of our team line, and the main metrics that you should follow judges for your adjudication, then later our first argument. Let's start therefore with our clarification of framework. First, the climate crisis is the most urgent problem globally. We're not we're on the tipping point of the problem. We're not just saying that the climate crisis is like we have to stop the climate crisis in order to stop environmental damages. We're saying that we already have extremely irreparable environmental damages. We just have to avoid the situation getting worse. Furthermore, the problem is that the environmental crisis is global because natural resources are water, atmosphere, land. They don't follow political borders. This means that if I'm emitting CO2, I'm not just damaging my own country, I'm also damaging the country around myself. So, on definitions, we will explain failing to meet the regulations and international sanctions in the model, so I will later talk about it, but now I will define what climate targets are. What we need is that they're all goals already set in, like, for example, international COPs or Tokyo's and Paris international agreements, to grant that those agreements have been already signed by most countries, meaning that most countries do agree on those agreements. So, at this point, let's move into the model. First, international sanctions will be regulated by the United Nations. Why it has to be the United Nations? First, it is the most recognized international organization, which is also super parties, granting an objective external point of view to ensure fairness. Second, there are already precedents where the UN has intervened forcing international sanctions. If the urgency is enough, like when it comes to peacekeeping and protecting human rights, the UN can enforce sanctions. So, for example, let's take the example of Russia. When Russia attacked Ukraine, the UN imposed sanctions to ensure that Russia will desist to invade Ukraine. So, the second point, there will be a system of warnings that will be imposed, ensuring gradual adaptations. We want a gradual system because it doesn't punish countries too severely if at first they fail to comply. This incentivizes countries to comply without suffering too many economic damages at first, to grant them resources to actually undergo these sustainable transitions. So, our system will be made of 3 warnings. At first, taxes will be imposed by the United Nations on all countries, and when they fail to better the system, the first thing is we'll be imposing taxes on them. Second, at the second warning, other countries will impose on them import duty taxes on non-sustainable products to further aggravate the economic damages on the sectors that are not actually environmentally friendly. The impact will be making non-sustainable production more costly than the environmental friendly one that I will later analyze in my first argument. The third point is other countries, the third warning will be when other countries and the UN could seize international resources that, for example, countries have outside or strong people will have outside in countries. For example, seizing assets that will damage, for example, lobbyists of those countries that have resources outside, creating an internal pressure to push for climate change. So, these resources that the UN will have gained through those sanctions will be later redirected to developing countries to help them go through the sustainable transition. The last point is failing to meet regulations means failing to meet the standards of previously mentioned organizations. So this means that countries will be controlled by UN officials, so they could actually be as impartial as possible, which we will explain in our second argument. And second, warnings will be once every 2 years, allowing countries to adapt, but at the same time putting pressure, because in 6 years they would reach maximum sanctions. Furthermore, these warnings will be given on proportional improvement. This means that countries would be evaluated on the proportional improvement based from the first situation. So, at this point, the matrix will be demonstrating whether or not countries who fail to meet climate targets should face international sanctions, and also demonstrating whether or not international sanctions are an effective method to fight climate change. So, our team is made by 2 arguments. First, sanctions make environmentally friendly economic growth the more sustainable option. Second, international sanctions ensure effective and fair solution to climate change. Let's start with the first argument. But if you want, you can give me a POI now. Do you have any POIs? Okay, no.
Yes, please could you elaborate on the fact that the United Nations is paralyzed by the Security Council, where there can be no decisions made without the acknowledgement of the Security Council.
Yeah, and the Security Council has power to vote, as every other democratic organization has. This means that countries would agree on the regulation, they vote on the regulations, and then the UN would have a separate organization that is not controlled by the Security Council to enforce regulation. What is the point here? Sorry. So So let's start with the first substantive of this argument. International sanctions act as an incentive to be sustainable. Panel, please acknowledge how high in a scale of important matters countries place economic growth. Why is that? The two main purposes of a country are prioritizing the well-being of its citizens and the growing of GDP to ensure the development of the nation. Growing the GDP does not mean abandoning sustainability, but unfortunately it's often the case in the status quo. For example, developing countries generally oppose environmental limitations because they fear they won't be economically sustainable. In our model, we incentivize to do so because we give them money to do this economic transition. So this means that regional limitations aren't created with the primary purpose of solving climate change in the most efficient way, but rather focusing on economic growth and local interests. So following the model previously brought, we are giving sanctions that incentivize a sustainable economic growth, making a non-sustainable economic growth more difficult. So it's a comparative. If sustainable economic growth in the status quo is more complicated than the non-sustainable one, we are making prices for the non-sustainable one rise in order to get the sustainable one be the most effective solution. So sanctions are damaging the economy, so that investing in the more sustainable solutions will be the best solution. It's going to be in the long term and often in the short term. So in the short term, because international sanctions will immediately damage the country's economy, and in the long term, because there will be more sanctions. So if you want to invest in sustainable economic growth, what you're ensuring to your country is that in the future you will have less sanctions than doing otherwise. So if I invest in sustainable economic growth, I will have less sanctions in the future. If I'm investing in non-sustainable growth, I am not going to get better, therefore I'm going to get the worst possible sanctions. So considering this means that this concept is considered an investment return. So in the long, the impacts are first, you are seeing countries to change through acting on their biggest incentive, GDP economic growth. This means that we are acting on the biggest motive that will push them to actually change. We want to change because we want to solve the climate crisis, therefore we have to act on their biggest incentive. Second, we are granting that countries will uphold the promises made in international organizations. In the status quo, they are not respecting international agreements because nobody is forcing them to do so. All we're pushing is a method to push them and force them to do so. Third, we are actually doing something for climate change. In the meaning that we are actually trying to solve and avoid the worst case scenario where for example, ice melting completely and having a world where the human life will be practically unsustainable. So you should stand with side proposition because we are the only side that will be in this debate, actually making change for environmental. Therefore, it's also forcing countries to actually do what they're promising in international agreements. And for all these reasons, I've never been prouder to propose.
Thank you very much for your fine speech. If my colleagues are ready, we can move 8 minutes. We can move to the first speaker of side opposition. Here.
Esteemed judges, worthy opponents, I'm Benedict, the first speaker of the opposition for the motion. This House believes that countries that fail to meet climate targets should face international sanctions. Today, we stand in firm opposition of this motion. We think the proposition has missed the following key terms of this debate: international sanctions. How would they get every country to comply with this international sanction? What happens if even one country does decide to not comply with the sanctions and still trade with other countries? Next, I want to mention the key stakeholders in this debate. First, the global economy, planet Earth as a whole, the countries facing the sanctions, but also, importantly, the countries imposing the sanctions will too lose in trade. The burdens of this case for the proposition are to prove how international sanctions are the right step towards climate action, while we will show why international sanctions are not the right approach to this complicated problem. Before I start with my speech, I would like to first push back on some of our opponents' early substantive work. Well, we've heard that the UN would enforce sanctions. However, I want to remind the judges and also the proposition that the UN, as of today, has not made any effective international sanctions to a country. The proposition cited Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, for example. However, I want to remind the propositions, also the judges, that there was no binding UN Security Council resolution on the attack in Ukraine. Russia has, because it's a member of the Security Council, a veto right to any resolutions. Therefore, there were no international sanctions. The only thing that happened were partly national sanctions by the EU and the US, for example. But most countries in the world actually increased their trade with Russia. India, for example, China too. They increased their trade with Russia. Therefore, we can see how national sanctions and this one have not worked to fight climate change. Now, I want to present the opposite model. And as the first speaker of opposition, I will explain that actually collaboration and cooperation are more effective than division and international sanctions. International sanctions are not effective enough and could do the opposite and create a dystopian future where, with local resistance against these sanctions. My colleague Elsa then will explain how sanctions would divert the attention and willingness from urgent climate actions, how the global economy would down spiral if we impose global sanctions. What we really need is a strong economy to fight climate change. Our third speaker then will engage in any necessary battle before putting a final point on our case. It will be then my privilege to give the reply speech. Now let me suggest our countermodel, which centers around our team line. It is better to encourage and enable countries to fight climate change than to punish them, leading to international division. I want to make one thing clear. Both the proposition and opposition are on the same side. We want to fight climate change. However, we think division is not the right thing. We can agree that climate change is the greatest challenge facing humankind today. But international sanctions are not the way to go. It is indeed far better to create global cooperation that allows all countries to share each other resources and technology. We would suggest subsidies on green technologies, for example, zero tariffs for all resources needed to fight climate change, as solar panels, for example, and we would furthermore propose true global cooperation in research for new solutions in the fight against climate change, such as atomic fusion energy, for example, a topic so broad that cannot be done by a single country. We need global cooperation of as many nations as possible to get to our goal and fight climate change by creating new green energies, for example. Our countries should work together to fight climate change.
If countries in your world are incentivized to collaborate, why they shouldn't be incentivizing ours? What is the difference between your world and our world? Please engage.
Well, I think there's a clear difference between sanctions and collaboration. I think that also sanctions do not work if a few countries are not in favor of the sanctions. For example, I would then engage in my next argument that international sanctions can lead to a parallel world. Also, I think that cooperation can be far more effective than sanctions. And cooperation is, for example, not, global cooperation in research is not dependent on the UN Security Council, for example. And now coming to my next argument that goes as follows. International sanctions risk creating a parallel world. Let me dive deeper into this argument. If the world somehow truly managed to set common climate targets, it's very difficult, and then implausibly imposes international sanctions, so all nations are on board, a country that doesn't reach this target obviously would be left outside of the world economy in general. Now, this might be actually the goal of the proposition, but I'm quite sure that this would not only be one country to be left outside of the world economy. And then, when more countries will be left outside of the world economy, this would be a problem. Yes, please.
That's why we have warnings. Please engage with her case.
I think that warnings can be a way to work with sanctions. However, I think that 6 years, for example, as you proposed, are far too little to actually reach true change. Also, my colleague Elsa will further engage on why sanctions are not can be over-demanding for developing countries, for example. Now, a country outside of the world economy when joined by another country, would forge an economic free trade zone of polluting countries, for example, because they're both outside of the world economy now. And this would actually incentivize countries outside of the world economy to further trade and to fully embrace cheap coal energy, for example, or cheap energy, cheap technology that is not climate friendly. Now, so a lot of countries then would maybe that not meet the target because we all acknowledge that fighting climate change is difficult, would be left outside of the world economy and would not even care about climate change, but rather about how they can thrive. And I think there are countries that could maybe not reach the targets, are for example countries that not even acknowledge climate change, Russia for example, or Iran for example. They could instead be left outside of this world economy and then forge their own economic zones. And as of today, more countries, it is sad but true, there are more countries willing to work on their own economy than to actually fight against climate change. So I think it would be very lucrative for these countries to be out of this harsh climate fighting, or then instead work together with, for example, China, that could too be left outside of the, but then in the moment the US too is not in the mood, we can say, to fight climate change. In conclusion, I've rebutted our opponents' arguments about their UN model, before I then explain our own model and elaborate on the fact that sanctions risk to create a parallel world. Dear judges, both sides want to fight climate change. While the proposition poses a very complicated and not realistic approach, we want to ensure that instead of division, sanctions, the countries would collaborate and cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can now move to the second speaker of side.
And I will be ready.
Yeah.
Yep.
But let me make you an applause. Here, here.
Okay, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so at first I would like to rebut what the opposition has stated so far. So we started by saying that when there was the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia had some of the problems that the sanctions that we would apply to the countries that don't meet the climate target. But Russia has seen their bank system collapsing, GDP collapse, gas export decrease, and also higher dependence from China's choice due to them becoming the main client. So the states like India grow to their economy, but they're not compelling at all with the fact that these sanctions that were made upon them also brought a really, really bad situation for Russia, as it should be, because as no, thank you. Because as they said at the end of the speech, Russia and Iran weren't compelled with the climate target, but they shouldn't suffer for reaching the target. They should suffer from not reaching the target. But as the opposition house, we don't see how that's a problem. If someone doesn't reach the climate targets, why shouldn't they be sanctioned? Why do the opposition house brought that example as something that is bad? That's not a problem. We believe that if someone doesn't meet the climate target, they should be sanctioned. And I will address that later in my speech. And I would like to analyze how the fact that they talked about the fact that other states would collaborate, but they didn't quite mechanize that They didn't say how countries would collaborate. They didn't say how that's exclusive to them. As my first speaker addressed with a POI, you didn't explain how that's exclusive to you. As I will later explain in my speech, the countries they are, no thank you, they are brought together, but with the fear of having sanctions, they will also collaborate, and I will mechanize that later. But the first speaker didn't quite stated how they would arrive to collaborating. And even if they mechanized it, a solution like that, so trying to make the state collaborate, doesn't work, because as in our status quo, they already tried it with like the Paris and Tokyo Agreement, but they didn't come to any conclusions because they aren't binding, because there aren't international sanctions, because countries focus more, as my first speaker stated, more on the economical situation rather than the climate problem. Because if they will lose, no thank you, they will lose their economic situation. They prefer to lose the climate, to not reach the climate targets rather than lose their economy. And my first speaker talked about that for a really long time, and the opposition house just says that that wouldn't work and didn't mechanize it at all. So right now I would like to start to talk about my points. So the fact that global recommendation ensure effective and fair solutions. For a global problem, such as the environmental issues, we need an international reaction. We can define climate crisis as a global issue for two main reasons. As my first speaker said, natural resources, land, water, and the atmosphere are shared assets, and they don't follow political borders. And second, every damage that a single country does has impacts across borders, like the CO2 release in Australia affected the air, oceans, and temperature in the Pacific Ocean islands and globally. And even if you agree on the fact that it's a global issue, countries need an international power to ensure the effectiveness and the reach of the climate targets. We need it because if each country acts alone, not pushed by the threat of an international sanctions, the results are limited. In the status quo, there are many agreements, as I said before, to better the environmental issues, such as the Tokyo and Paris Agreement. But these efforts don't reach the target for a main reasons. Countries act individually. And if right now in the status quo, countries act individually, and the opposition house didn't state how, in their word, countries would act countries would collaborate. So this is the status quo. Countries act individually. Some countries might invest in green infrastructures, while at the same time, other countries that, as the first speaker said, are bounded by economical greed, double down on fossil fuels, undoing the process of the other countries. To actually make a difference, we need to act organically and carry proportionate. Yes.
So you think that exactly those countries who are doubling down on fossil fuel will then vote for international sanctions in a UN Security Council?
Okay, we're not talking about how we would we would do these laws. That's not what the motion is about. We're talking about if they should have international sanctions. So we're not talking about if that would apply. We're not talking about if the UN would do it. We're talking about if they should have international sanctions. So that's really not in the motion. So to actually make a difference, we need to act organically and carry proportionate and equal burdens. We need the panel to keep in mind that this is necessary. Laws are made to disincentivize non-desirable behaviors, and not caring about the environmental climate issues can't be accepted, and it is a behavior that should be sanctioned. But why would we need international sanctions? Why would we need an international push? Without it, countries might claim to implement policies but fail to follow through. That is something that happens in the status quo, that is called greenwashing, and that is happening in your world as well, because countries are not collaborating. They are doing greenwashing. So they claim to implement the policies, but they don't follow through. Having the threat to incur into a punishment will lead to fairness, because everyone will make sure that the rules are respected.
POI.
Yes.
punishing is a better way than collaborating together, also in psychology in general?
Okay, so we're not talking about psychology, we're talking about countries and economical situation, and that's really not the case, because we're not talking about that, and the fact that they are countries, they're not psychological, and that doesn't work in your word because you didn't mechanize it, or if it works, you didn't explain it really well, I'm sorry. But the fairness will also bring a smaller impact, that is pollution heaven. So that industry try to avoid paying environmental taxes or respect the strict environmental laws. So an international sanction ensures that countries act for the humanity's interest and not for the self-interest. That is something that is happening in our status quo. We will share responsibility fairly, and progress will be real and not performative. But because when you try to collaborate without binding laws, that is what happens. Countries don't progress, they just are progressing in a performative way. And I'll never be prouder to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. We can now go back to side opposition with the speech that is going to be given by Elsa, whenever you're ready. Here, here.
Dear judges, worthy opponents, I am Elsa, the second speaker of the opposition against the motion. This House believes that countries that fail to meet climate change should face international sanctions. I will, as Benedict mentioned, extend our case with a close investigation of the fact that with the imposing of sanctions and of targets, we would not solve the core issue of climate change, but merely divert attention and willingness to fight this issue. Because we have the moral imperative to fight climate change and not the moral imperative to force international sanctions. But before I delve into my compelling argument, I want to inspect the proposition's previous case and claims and push back on a few. The proposition mentioned the COP initiatives as a model for the type of agreement. But may I remind the panel that the COP initiatives in the last years did not even come to a conclusion. This means that these types of agreements as a model are not going to work on an international level because they have already not worked. Also, I want to push back on the statement that the Russian situation, the Russian economy, has gotten worse since the implementation of the sanctions. This is, in fact, simply not true. Russian economy grew since the imposition of the sanctions. They still have many economical partners, such as India and China. In addition to that, and this is central, the sanctions were not international, but only the USA and the EU imposed the sanctions. This undermines the proposition's case. The sanctions used as an example, the sanctions against Russia, were not international. They can therefore not be used as an example. Also, the proposition stated that some countries...
Sorry?
Yes, please.
Even if they were not completely approved by everybody, can you acknowledge that even half of the word of losing market is still a heavy damage to the economy of a country?
Thank you for your question. What you stated is that Russia's economy got worse, but this is not true. Russia's economy got better. It might be true that other countries suffered more, but this still does not support your point that Russian economy got worse. Also, the proposition stated that some countries only focus on their economy, and therefore we need the sanctions to drift their attention. But would this not just tell us that exactly those countries will simply pay the sanctions and continue with their harmful behavior? Also, we might not be talking about psychology, this is true, but the principle, yes please.
Didn't we explain with a whole model and with our first argument how that is not true? Like,
in reference to what? I'm sorry.
in reference to the fact that to the economy, in face to the economical growth, to the economic.
Well, thank you for your question, but my point still stands. The claim you made is simply untrue. It is not true that Russian economies got worse. It's not true. They still have incredible partners to trade with. China, for example. Like, it is simply not true. I hope I answered your QI. We are not talking about psychology, this is clear. But we're talking about the principle of psychology. Cooperation works better. We know this from our everyday life. Let's apply this principle also in global cooperation. Forcing someone is not going to make them actually do something. It's just just not going to work. Cooperation, on the other hand, enforces and motivates people to willingly do something. And if there's a will, there's a way. But if we don't have the will behind something, it is not just going to happen. Now that I've successfully rebutted the opponent's claim, I want to delve into our arguments to show how the opponent's model may seem positive at first glance, but is actually counterproductive. I want to reaffirm our team line. It is better to encourage and enable countries to fight climate change than to punish them and leading to international division. Let me show you why our proposal is better. First, our job, our biggest challenge is to stop climate change. We agree with the proposition that global warming is the biggest plague of our century, but it is not our job to impose sanctions or targets. International sanctions and targets would only divert attention from and willingness from the fight against climate change. Let me explain to you how if the targets are too low, we would not fight climate change, since too low implies that countries are still not doing enough. For example, if a student is told he needs a 6 to fulfill the expectation of the parents and make them proud, he will only try to reach the 6. The same applies to countries because they just won't go the extra mile. On the other hand, if the targets are set too high, countries will just not reach them and not even try, because they simply do not see the light at the end of the tunnel. If you now, how the proposition suggests, impose sanctions, the countries affected have even less resources to fight climate change, and we would take a step backwards, because instead of focusing on climate change, the countries affected would be more focused on either opposing sanctions than the real threat of climate change itself. It is now clear that both targets and sanctions are counterproductive and would not help against climate change. Lastly, I would like to talk about the economic aspect of such a daring step. Let me start my argument by stating something that may seem obsolete. It is crucial to reiterate. A strong global economy is needed to fight climate change. How else can we fight it effectively? Technologies, investments, they all require money. What would the outcome of international sanctions be? An enormous global economic recession and further geopolitical friction. Firstly, international sanctions have never and never will exist. Who imposes them? With all the states impose sanctions, that will never happen and is in fact also dangerous. While some may impose sanctions, others won't, because it's in their best interest not to. With the current challenges, who would want to voluntarily go through an economic hell? Sanctions would create an economic downside for the ones imposing them and the receiving countries, while others who don't impose them, and as I want to repeat, it's impossible that everyone adheres to the sanctions, now benefit from having avoided economic crisis. Secondly, this approach only fuels, as my colleague has truly exposed before, geopolitical tension, which is combined with economic havoc and the last thing our world needs. Global problems require global cooperation and not global punishment. The countries imposing and the countries receiving sanctions will lose important economic capital. Full stop. I have successfully reinforced our team before rebutting our opponent's case, primarily the example of sanctions against Russia and how that impacted the economy. That is simply not true. It made the economy better. They still have partners. I then explained how targets and sanctions are not a sensible way to help fight climate change, but only divert attention and create division, before moving on to elaborate that we need strong global economy to fight climate change, which would only be hurt by international sanctions. I firmly oppose this motion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your speech. We can now go back to side proposition. Their third speech. Here.
3, 2, 1. Okay, as the first speaker of the propositions team, what can you expect from this speech? I will go through the clashes of this debate, and I will explain to you why proposition side is the best and is the one you should vote for. First of all, I want to go through the two clashes of this debate. First one, which side foster better compliance to climate targets? And second one, which side foster global collaboration? Okay, as the first class said, which side foster better compliance to climate targets? So what does that mean? That means which of the two sides really brings an impact? What the opposition failed to explain is how their solution would actually bring an impact. They tried to explain to us how the countries would just collaborate without telling us if they really would, and failing to explain to us why that's exclusive to them. Why can in their world countries collaborate but they can't in ours? They also pushed on the fact that in our world people wouldn't want the sanctions, they wouldn't want international sanctions, but if international sanctions help this economical growth for everyone, as my first speaker spent a lot of time explaining why these international sanctions would actually help everyone who follows the economical sustainability solution to grow economically rather than lose. So this sanction will actually help everyone. So why people would be against them? Why wouldn't people collaborate to find them? How opposition expect countries to collaborate in their world but not in ours? Why would they collaborate? Even like the difference between proposition and opposition, just a second please. The difference between proposition and opposition is that in our case, if someone doesn't do something, if someone goes against like sustainable economical growth, we have something that prevents that from happening. So we are doing something against climate change. Yes.
Could you please elaborate on the fact how countries would work together when they're facing global sanctions from each other?
Sorry, could you
please elaborate on the fact how countries would still collaborate when they are facing global sanctions from each other?
Yes, of course. My second speaker spent a lot of time telling us how the global regulation is an effective and fair solution. So, as now I will explain to you, why would they collaborate even though they have sanctions? Is because we are actually making a difference. So we need, and to make this difference, we need to act organically and carry proportionate and equal burdens. So people would collaborate because they need it in order for it to be in order for the situation to get better, they will have to collaborate. But moving on, so opposition failed to explain how their solution would actually bring impacts. What are the impacts of their solution? We are not sure that their solution will work. We are not sure that people will collaborate. And if they won't collaborate, what will they do? They won't have anything against that. They don't have a model which actually does something against people that decide to just not collaborate and not go for an unsustainable solution. While in our world, we have something against that. We are not saying that people won't collaborate. We are not saying that people will always have sanctions. We are just saying that if someone doesn't do something against it, we have sanctions to prevent that from happening. So we actually have an impact. Who is helping climate change better? We are helping climate change better, yes.
Thank you. In our model, we proposed a zero tax policy on renewable green energy. So we would actually encourage countries to engage in environmental actions. How do you engage with that? Thank you.
Actually, I didn't think you brought that, but even say that you brought that, that doesn't change the fact that zero taxes, how would that help you? Like, if someone decides to not go economically sustainable, that wouldn't change. Like, that wouldn't change the case. Like, if I don't want to go economically sustainable, it doesn't matter if I'm tax-free. If I gain more money by going economical unsustainable, I'm still gonna do that, even though I'm not gonna go sustainable if that makes me lose money. In your world, that makes you lose money. Also, you spend a lot of time on our example on Russia, trying to attack our example. But first of all, that's not the only example we brought. We brought Paris. who you didn't actually say anything about that. And also you said that the developing countries are damaged by our work and our model, but developing countries are actually helped by our model, because our model ensured for them an economic growth who's sustainable, so they can grow sustainably as well as developed countries. We know that developed countries are usually the less sustainable one. So in this way, we are promoting developing countries, so developing countries can develop in a sustainable way, but still be on the market. And developed countries can go sustainable and be, so everything is equal. And equality is one of the main impacts of our debate, as my first speaker clearly stated. And going to the second question, which side foster global collaboration? And again, opposition failed to explain to us why collaboration is just exclusive to them. Why can we have collaboration? Why can people collaborate in our world as well? And as I already explained, the difference between our world and their world is that they can't do anything if someone decides to not collaborate, but we are doing something against it. Also, I would like to retake what a POI that was done to my second speaker. So, do you think people would accept international sanctions? Yes, I think that people would accept international sanctions, because that helps them to grow economically. Because we are promoting a model in which, thanks to the sanctions, all the countries can economically grow in a faster way and in a more sustainable way. So we are helping climate change and we're helping economical growth as well. We are doing something good. I don't understand what is wrong with that. And you also said, do you still think it's better to punish rather than collaborate? Again, I don't know why we can't collaborate, but at the same time, if someone doesn't follow the sustainable solution, then yes, I think punishment is the only way you can actually prevent that from happening. So maybe countries won't be happy, but at least we would have a change. Climate change is an important matter, and in which world climate change is solved better? In a world where in some cases people decide to collaborate, but they can't do anything if they don't, or in a world where in every single case countries collaborate with each other. In that way, we are really doing something against climate change, and we are preventing it from happening. And I want to remember you, so for the end of my speech, that opposition didn't recognize to us how collaboration actually just works for them, and how their model works, and how the model prevents the climate problems from happening. Well, in our world, we are preventing a real solution against climate change. And thank you. That's it.
So let's close the benches of this debate with the last speech from side opposition. Here.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Dearest judges, honorable opponents, I'm Massimiliano, the third speaker for the opposition side in this crucial debate. I'm honored to be here to talk about this interesting topic. In fact, we can all agree that proposition and opposition agree on the fact that climate change is a real fact. However, our worldviews distinct in the fact how we approach this interesting debate. I'm going to tackle my speech in this way. I'm going to take our opponent's case under intense scrutiny, principally regarding their points, regarding the international sanctions by the EU, the sanctions that would not end in a downward spiral. They misinterpreted the fact about Russia, that we didn't say how we would collaborate, when in fact we clearly presented some examples as raised in a POI and as talked about in the speech of my colleague Benedict in his first speech. Before then, saying why people, as third speaker of proposition has asked, why people would in fact not collaborate. So then ultimately highlighting our team line. Punishment is not an effective solution for a global matter that requires cooperations on a worldwide scale. So let me start with that. Speaker 3 in the proposition has made the rhetorical question, why would people not decide to collaborate? Now, of course, this may sound rational. Everyone agrees that climate change is in fact a real threat. However, they themselves have stated there are states who would like to make money. And I think we can all agree that if I slap you in the face, there's no way that I'm gonna build up a relationship to this person. This means that imposing sanctions on someone is in no way a good premise to start global corporations. Or are we gonna expect countries to start global corporations with countries that they are themselves sanctioning? Then I would like to highlight to the dear panel that our POI was distorted by the third speaker of the proposition. She said, we raised the point, do you think that countries would vote for that? While the POI was raised differently. Do you think that exactly those same countries doubling down on fossil fuels would decide to vote for the measures taken in the UN Security Council? Now this brings us to a next logical step. International sanctions would be imposed by the UN. However, let's be real. The word the proposition is here offering to us is dystopian. It's utopian. In no word, more than 158 countries will agree on the exact same targets when there are crucial differences between those countries and where they would like to go. It's not possible. Or can you agree that more than 150 countries, more than 6 billion people on this earth, more than 7 billion people on this earth, represented by democratic or not democratic elected officials, will agree on the same exact targets? This is not the case. Yes, please.
But you believe that they will collaborate?
Sorry,
You believe that they will collaborate? Like they won't reach an agreement, but you think that they will collaborate? How that would work? Sorry.
Thank you very much for your question. I think the risk of not collaborating is in fact much more higher if we impose sanctions on them. And this brings me then on a burden of the proposition and not a burden of the opposition. They stated multiple times why collaboration is not exclusive to us, while the burden of the proposition is clearly to show that sanctioning will in fact lead to fighting climate change. Will it or will it not? Our burden as the opposition is not to show that global collaboration cannot exist in their world, but that global collaboration is in fact way much more effective, more likely and more efficient if it's not linked to international sanctions. That's the point I've raised before, and I hope this answers your POI. Now, this brings us then to the next point that we talked about, and even though I would like to highlight to the panel that this is not directly linked to our debate, the point about Russia is crucial to understand because it was then in fact again misinterpreted by the proposition. The point about Russia was not raised in regards to economical aspects, but in regards to the impossibility of the UN to impose international sanctions. Speaker 1 of the proposition stated that there are already examples of international sanctions. The point about Russia was raised to show that this fact was invented. There were never such things as international sanctions imposed. They were discussed, but the Security Council in the UN forbid the veto right of Russia forbade that international sanctions came into place. So how is this going to happen? It's not possible. Now, if they should be punished or not, the Speaker 2 of the proposition stated, adopted a more Socratic approach to this debate. Because I think the Speaker stated, should they be, the question of this debate is not if they should be punished, or is if they should be punished, and not if the UN would implement it. Well, why did Speaker 1 of the proposition then explain the whole model? I think here lies a big misunderstanding of ethics. The word should, of course, implies a moral obligation. However, this moral obligation then, in fact, ties to real facts in our work. When asked the POI, the response was, well, the motion is not about how the UN or if the UN should do it, but they should be punished. However, I think this is a clear contradiction of the motion themselves and the point they have raised within the proposition themselves. In summary, dearest judges, I want to relink my offered rebuttals to our own compelling arguments, which I think remain equally unshakable. because I think I want to show by highlighting again our argument that it is not true that we have not shown how countries would collaborate. Consider our proposed countermodel. The way towards the future lies in shared global responsibility for mutual benefit. So this means fighting a transboundary issue, as correctly stated by Speaker 2 of that proposition, but by sharing technologies, sharing resources, abandoning tariffs on resources that are crucial for climate change. Are those not proposed ideas of how to fight, how to collaborate together, how to fight together against the common enemy, climate change? What about the diverted attention? The primary imperative for us is to fight against climate change. The non-existing middle ground, highlighted by the Speaker 2 of the opposition, my colleague Elsa, that either the targets are too low or they are too high, goes to show that we need to encourage countries, not punish them. I want to repeat, dearest judges, we are looking towards a grey future. Climate change is haunting, it's a threat. However, I think we should be realistic. The world is not a big green place, unfortunately, both metaphorically and both in the real world. However, I think we should be realistic. I think we can all agree that geopolitical tensions will arise if we start sanctioning people. It will, in fact, exacerbate current issues that countries are dealing right now. It means that countries, both imposing and receiving the sanctions, will lose important economic capital. It will mean that the mentioned pollution habits will exist when exactly countries do not apply to the same sanctions. In short, I firmly oppose. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the end of the first part of the debate. Let's move promptly into the second with the reply for side opposition. Here, here. And as far as climate change is concerned, please turn off the lights. Oh, okay. Much more relaxing.
Honorable judges, fellow debaters, I thank you for the opportunity to write a reply speech for the opposition. Following so closely on the heels of my colleague Massimiliano, I cannot but notice the depth and variety of this debate. And sincere thank you to all involved. My role now is to lay out the main points of clash before summarizing our own compelling arguments. Our first point of clash emerged on how to actually enforce these global sanctions. Well, the first speaker mentioned the UN, the second speaker stated that it is not part of the debate of how to get and how to actually enforce these international sanctions. We think the proposition contradicted themselves in this argumentation. We explained in great depth and variety how international sanctions will not and will never be fully agreed on. International sanctions have never been fully agreed on because many countries still disagree on too many topics. Next, our second speaker elaborated on the fact that sanctions the sanctions harm not only the countries that faces them, but also the country that imposes them. We have not heard a convincing response from the proposition on this field. In addition to that, the third speaker dismissed the economically proven practice of subsidies and incentives. In this point of clash, we clearly proposed a model on how global cooperation would actually help fighting climate change. Furthermore, the proposition mentioned that we, as the opposition, offered nothing to the countries that are not complying. Well, I think we offer them the best possible solution. Incentives for green energy. No taxes on green energy, for example. And why is this exclusive to us? Because I fundamentally believe that a country faced with international sanctions will not further collaborate with other countries. And this connects to a whole team line. It's better to encourage and enable countries to fight climate change rather than punishing them, leading to international division. Next, proposition has not addressed the economic down spiral that international sanctions create. What happens if multiple countries, maybe even the world leading economies, are not meeting the target and decide to just abandon the sanctions? We have not heard a convincing response from the proposition on this field. In summary, we've explained our countermodel that centers on global cooperation, incentives, and sharing resources. A cooperation that is not possible if we impose sanctions on everyone. We have explained how the international sanctions not only harm the countries facing them, but also the countries imposing them. We've also explained that creating sanctions would divert attention from the real problem, climate change, and the global economy would down spiral if we start to impose sanctions. And what we rather need is a strong economy that fights climate change. In conclusion, at the end of this debate, we can state that we stand between two worlds. While we both want to fight the same goal, we both want to fight climate change for the sake of our planet. The proposition has proposed an unrealistic utopian model of international sanctions, while we center on the psychologically cooperational model of global cooperation in research and fighting climate change generally. At the end of this debate, we stand between, on the one side, division, sanctions, isolation, on the other side, cooperation and collaboration. Thank you.
We are now coming to the very end of the debate. The reply from side proposition. Here.
Opposition that to grant that the change will happen, it has to happen before in the past, we would have never been in the moon, for example, because if you think about it, we never had been in the moon, and then we went to the moon because we wanted to bring change. In the same way, if we never had rules to enforce climate change actions, that doesn't mean strictly that it won't happen in the future. So as a replier of proposition, what can you expect from this speech? You can get two main things. First, I will bring the clashes and the criteria on which you should judge this debate, and then through the clashes I will analyze the comparative on how proposition and opposition behaved in contrast. So let's start with the first clashes. Which side fosters better compliance to the goal against climate change? And the criteria in this case is which side has stronger incentives, which side incentivizes countries to actually fight climate change. What will you get from proposition is that compliance can't always come from willingness, because willingness is not consistent. Countries can change their mind throughout the time. But that there is a need to grant constant incentives to ensure that actual kind of constant fight against climate change happens. Therefore, we have to impose sanctions, so that sanctions, once they are imposed, they will stay there, they will still incentivize country economically to fight against climate change, making it the most sustainable economical solutions. What you get instead of opposition is that there are pushes that collaboration does enough to push countries to act together to fight for climate change. Let's look at the comparative. What happens is that we grant incentives in the short and long term. We grant that if a country changes the idea, they still have incentives to fight climate change, because comparatively, economically, it's better to do so, because comparatively, economically, they will have the sanctions to push for climate change. What you instead will get from opposition is that if a country changes their idea, if countries doesn't want to collaborate anymore, they don't bring any change. We want change because change means fighting fighting the climate change. Therefore, we should send the opposition because we grant at least a certain amount of change to actually fight against climate change. Let's go to the second question. Sorry. Which side foster global collaboration? Let's look at a comparative. We push toward the bench that if countries will collaborate in their work, if they will share resources in their work, they will be as incentivized as well to collaborate in finding a solution in our. Therefore, agreeing to a system that ensures that in the future the fight for climate change will be constant. If you believe that sanctions will decrease the desire to collaborate after sanctions, countries would still have the incentives to fight climate change because once you create the sanctions, they're still in place. So this means that even if the idea of sanctions might decrease incentives for countries, this doesn't mean that they won't have any more incentives if what happens is that in their side, if they lose the collaboration, because sanctions will still be in place once they are placed. So furthermore, if they won't get collaboration against, they won't bring any change. Before if the main thing you have to keep in mind is that for their team to work, everything has to stem from collaboration. So if they say to us that countries in our world won't collaborate, that kind of destroys their whole team line because if countries don't collaborate in ours, they won't collaborate in theirs as well. But the thing is, if in ours countries won't collaborate, they will still have sanctions to actually fight the climate change. While in their world, if they won't get collaboration, what happens is that they won't actually effectively bring any change because no countries will actually fight for climate change and there won't be anything to impose the respect of international national agreements. What instead we get again is that even if they stop collaborating, the regulation will still be in place and regulation will still be upheld and protected because economic incentives will still be in place. So in the comparative, this clash heavily falls on propositions. So what you should vote on is you should vote on who better protects climate change, and second, who grants global collaborations. And for all these reasons, I've never been proud to propose.
Thank you very much to you all. Please shake hands.